Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving straight into what I think is one of the most fascinating and kind of contradictory fiscal reforms in recent Nigerian economic history. We're talking about the massive 2026 fiscal policy measures approved by the Minister of Finance. This is a total recalibration of how the country handles automotive trade and environmental taxes. It's a huge shift, and to really grasp why this matters to us and the broader economy, we've got to look at the numbers driving the whole shebang.
But before we talk money, we really need to talk stakes. Get this. The World Health Organization estimates that air pollution causes around 70,000 premature deaths in Nigeria every single year. That is a staggering human cost. And a massive contributor to this urban air quality crisis, especially in megacities like Lagos, is vehicle emissions. See, the country has built this heavy structural dependence on imported, often really old, used vehicles. So there's a very real, very deadly environmental cost to how folks currently get around.
Meanwhile, let's flip over to the economic side of the equation. Despite literally decades of high protectionist tariffs that were supposed to kickstart local automotive manufacturing, the motor vehicle assembly sector contributed a microscopic 0.04% to Nigeria's GDP in 2021. Yeah, 0.04%. For years, the government slapped a massive 70% effective duty on fully built imported vehicles, right? The idea was to protect local industry. But as that tiny number shows, building a giant tariff wall definitely didn't translate into a booming domestic sector.
Which brings us to Section 1, Nigeria's broken auto industry and a failed policy. By the time the April 2026 fiscal policy measures were approved, everyone kind of knew the old system of throwing up massive tariff walls had demonstrably failed.
Just look at the stark contrast here. Across 33 licensed assembly plants in the country, they actually have the installed capacity to build 400,000 vehicles a year. Yet, actual domestic production was languishing at less than 11,000 units. Most of these plants were basically just doing basic assembly of semi-knockdown parts. So these high tariffs essentially just created a super high-cost environment for consumers, but totally failed to generate real industrial capacity. The status quo was, well, entirely unsustainable.
All right, let's move on to Section 2, the 2026 fiscal shock and a radical new plan. To fix this broken industry and tackle that deadly pollution crisis we just talked about, the government approved a radical new master plan. And it introduces a massive, honestly fascinating paradox.
On the surface, the two main pillars of this 2026 reform seem completely at odds with each other. On one hand, you've got this massive tariff reduction meant to lower the cost of a car for the everyday consumer. But, literally, on the exact same date, the policy framework introduces a brand new green tax surcharge that increases costs based on environmental impact. So you might be wondering, how on earth can a government lower taxes to help consumers while simultaneously introducing a brand new tax? Let's dig into Section 3, the Vehicle Tariff Cut and Consumer Relief, to unravel this mystery layer by layer. Let's start with the massive drop in the total effective tariff on fully built passenger vehicles, dropping all the way from 70% down to 40%.
So what does this actually mean for real wallets? Let's say you have a standard imported passenger vehicle with a base value of $10,000. Under the old 70% regime, all those duties and levies would push the landed cost up to $17,000. But under the new 40% setup, that landed cost drops pretty significantly down to $14,000.
That is a direct $3,000 savings for the consumer on the duty-inclusive import price. And this is absolutely crucial right now. You know, after the removal of fuel subsidies in 2023, transportation costs and inflation just skyrocketed. Buying a car became completely prohibitive for the middle class. So this tariff reduction acts as a much-needed palliative. It lowers the capital cost of owning a vehicle, which really helps offset the pain of those higher daily operating costs.
But staying completely impartial here, we've got to look at the other side of this gamble. A sudden flood of cheaper imported vehicles poses an existential risk to Nigeria's fragile domestic assembly plants. If they don't get targeted support to modernize, they could literally be wiped out by an import surge. That protective margin they used to rely on? Severely eroded. And since they're already operating at subscale levels, we could be looking at some significant employment shifts if assembly activity contracts.
That brings us right to Section 4, the green tax strategy and pricing pollution. This is the second half of our policy paradox taken effect in July 2026, the introduction of the green tax surcharge.
Now, to understand why this is actually brilliant economics, we need a quick dive into the theory. The green tax is a classic Pigouvian tax. Basically, it internalizes negative environmental externalities, like the air pollution causing those 70,000 deaths we mentioned,
by directly taxing the harmful activity itself. But it also creates what economists love to call a double dividend. It financially discourages deadly air pollution while simultaneously generating millions in brand new government revenue.
To put that in perspective, Nigeria's vehicle import market is worth roughly $2.3 billion annually. Even a modest green tax on that base could easily generate hundreds of millions of dollars. The secret sauce to making this work without hurting low-income citizens is revenue recycling. This new money can be hypothecated, which just means legally ring-fenced, to fund critical public transport, healthcare for pollution victims, or even provide rebates for clean technologies like EVs and the presidential CNG initiative.
And here is the true genius of how these seemingly contradictory policies actually fit together like a giant puzzle. It essentially segments the market. If you buy a clean, new, or highly efficient car, you get to keep that sweet $3,000 tariff savings we calculated earlier. But if you try to import a dirty, heavily polluting old used car, well, the new green tax penalizes you, effectively wiping out any of those tariff savings.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 5. Will this gamble work? Let's take a look at the future outlook by segmenting the market this way. The government is steering consumer choice toward cleaner, more efficient vehicles while completely avoiding blanket price increases that would needlessly hurt the middle class. But as we know, executing this is an entirely different beast.
Looking at the timeline over the next decade, you can really see how this all builds. In 2026, the 40% tariff cut and the initial green tax take effect. By 2027, the green tax rates are scheduled to escalate. And then, jumping to 2036, Nigeria plans to completely eliminate import adjustment taxes. The big takeaway here, Nigeria is fundamentally shifting away from high-protection trade taxes, swapping them out for domestic environmental taxation so they can fully integrate into the massive 1.3 billion-person AfCFTA continental market.
But let's be real, for this master plan to actually succeed, the government has to clear some massive hurdles. First up, they absolutely must ensure foreign exchange stability. If the naira depreciates, it's going to completely wipe out any tariff savings for the consumer. Second, they have to figure out how to execute highly complex emissions testing at customs, which requires a major modernization of infrastructure. And third, they have to actively support local assemblers to transition away from a broken, protected model and help them integrate into broader regional African supply chains. So, we are left with the ultimate question. Will the 2026 reforms actually save Nigeria's auto industry and clean up the air, or are we just setting up another cycle of policy disappointment and high costs? The framework is theoretically brilliant, for sure, but its execution is what will define Nigeria's economic and environmental future for decades. What do you think? Can a single tax structure really save an industry and the environment at the exact same time?